Welcome to this next video in the history of Rome, in which we will go through the Roman Republic.
To the end of the Second Punic War in 200 BC.
After the fall of the final dictator in Tarquinius Superbus, the final king of Rome, Rome engaged in a series of Italic Wars, in which Rome learned to make many adaptations to better improve its fighting and operations. So whenever you see a thought bubble like this, that's something that the Romans learned from that incident. For about 100 years, Rome engaged in pretty much incessant squabbling with the Aequi and the Volsci down south of Rome. And that was pretty good. The Romans learned a lot from that experience. They got better as a fighting power. But then everything came to a head here in this year, 390. Now, this was one of the only two times in history that Rome was sacked. And the way you can remember the two dates is that each date was 10 years away from the year 400. So Rome will be sacked once in this year, 390. Really, the year is 389, not just 390, but we'll go with it. And then later again in the year 410 AD. So Rome was sacked once at the start of its history and once at the end of its history. The story is that during this time, Rome had just started a series of wars called the Etruscan Wars. And the problem for the Romans was that they were fighting both the Etruscans in the north and the Volsci in the south at the same time. So the Romans appointed a famous dictator named Camillus. And this is kind of a not too good picture of him. But the story is that Camillus sent an embassy up to talk with both the Etruscans and the Celts at the same time. Now, another name for the Celts is the Gauls. Now, when this embassy arrived, one of the Roman ambassadors killed a Gallic chieftain. Now, to Gauls, honor is everything. So the Gauls immediately demanded that Rome hand over this ambassador. And when Rome wouldn't do that, the Gauls decided that they were going to teach the Romans a lesson. And so the Gallic leader, this guy, Brennus, took his army and went marching straight at Rome. He let everybody know, hey, we're just passing through. We have a bone to pick with Rome. And they bypassed most of the Roman army, and the only Roman army that was there to defend was beaten solidly at this battle, the Battle of Allia. And the Gauls came in and sacked Rome, burned the city. Now, the Romans had sent most of their people away into safe villages far away. And then the fighting soldiers basically barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, which was like the citadel. And the story is that they kept feeding the sacred geese of Juno, because there was also a temple of Juno there on the Capitoline Hill. And they were grumbling because they were running out of food, and why should we keep feeding these geese? But the geese saved the day, because the Gauls had camped out here in the Campus Martius, and then one day they found a path up the side of the Capitoline, and they decided to launch a sneak attack. And they had made it up the path and were getting ready to attack the wall when the sacred geese of Juno started honking. And suddenly the Romans knew that there was an attack underway, and so they survived. Okay, but Rome was burned. Now, the Romans realized that the Gauls, as is typical of Gauls, weren't coming to stay and to wipe out the Roman city. No, they were just here for booty. So the Romans offered to pay off the Gauls, to pay them a huge price of ransom in gold. And so here's a picture of the Romans weighing out a certain amount of gold equal to all the weights that Brennus, their leader, has put in the other pan of the scale. And you can see Brennus here putting something else in the scale. That's his sword. And the story is that when Brennus did this, kind of requiring the Romans to load even more gold on the other scale, the Romans protested, hey, that's not fair. And Brennus uttered this famous comment that would be used throughout history ever after that. Why victis? Woe to the conquered. In other words, I'm in charge here. I beat you. You beggars can't be choosers. You can't argue with me. However, the Roman leader, Camillus, returned at that moment gloriously and threw his sword on the other scale and said, "Rome is redeemed not by gold but by iron." And this was so annoying to Brennus that the situation developed into a street battle and then into a real battle, and the Romans drove the Gauls out of Rome. Sure, right. Maybe. What a glorious story. But the other story is that no, the Romans just paid off Brennus. So anyways, Brennus and his Gauls went back to their homelands in northern Italy, and they migrated, actually, farther out to the east. This very tribe of Gauls kept on going, and they migrated to a place called Galatia, or the Gallia of the East, right in central Anatolia. So if you ever read St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, that was where Brennus and his Gauls ultimately ended up, and were later conquered by the Romans, but that was much later. So after surviving this disaster, the Romans realized that they needed to get better in a lot of things. They needed to be smarter about dealing with their enemies, and they needed to improve their skills as a fighting power. So in the Etruscan Wars, the first thing that the Romans really learned to do and get good at was to build their camp, called a castra, for plural for many castles, which would surround the camp wall. Okay, so why did the Romans need camp building? Well, the reason is because at the end of a day's march, you had to go to sleep, and that was a perfect time for these wild bands of people like the Gauls to come and attack you. So the Romans had learned their lesson, and they would, at the end of every march, they would always build a camp on the spot in which to sleep. And this was a very complex process. It took a while for the Romans to really get good at this. But once they did, it was a honed system. And every soldier knew exactly what he would do when they would arrive at their place of camp building. They would even carry the parts of the camp with them. Like each Roman had to carry a stake for the palisade wall that would go around the edge. So this was the first big Roman advance to improve their skill as a fighting power. The Etruscan Wars signaled the end of the Etruscan civilization, and they were not united very much. Unlike Rome, where anytime Rome would get in power, it would negotiate and get that city under its control. The Etruscans were much more Celtic and tribal in their ways, more loose. And so Rome was able to, one by one, capture each one of these Etruscan cities and bring it under the Roman power. So the Etruscan civilization had begun around 700, and you can see that here by 350 it was basically over. I have a picture of an Etruscan tomb. If you ever visit Tuscany, the Etruscans constructed these huge tomb cities outside their normal cities. And here you can see the Italian green, white, and red, which is so classically Italian. So Tuscany is really the heart of Italian culture. So in any case, the next big problem for the Romans would be the Samnites. Rome would engage in 3 Samnite Wars immediately after the Etruscan Wars. And here's a picture of the Samnites. Now, who are these Samnite peoples? Well, the Samnites are a mountain people, and they are as hard as steel, as hard as iron. You can see their location here in the dark green. And Rome would never really conquer the Samnites. They would beat them in battle over and over and over. But the Samnites, because they lived in mountains, just could not be controlled. They could always go back to their cities, and the moment the Romans were gone, the Samnites were back to their old tribal ways again. Unlike the Etruscans, the Samnites would regularly unite their tribes for battle. So they were a dangerous force to the Romans for many years. And so Rome had to learn several things in order to deal with this. The first thing the Romans had to learn was to fight like the
Samnites
in their mountain country. And from the Etruscans, they learned this next thought bubble, the maniple. Now, what's the maniple? Well, from the ancient world, from the Greeks, everyone had learned to fight in the phalanx formation, which is basically this. It's a wall of spears. And this long wall would be like a mile wide. So, that's one big mass of troops. But this thing didn't work in the hill and mountain country where the Samnites lived. So the Samnites actually fought using this system called the manipular system. And it was basically a checkered board. Now, it doesn't look like a checkerboard here, but it was, where every block would cover the space in between the two blocks in front of it. So the Romans
learned or stole this maniple system from the Samnites.
And the whole idea was that every little block had space to maneuver. It could go forward, backward, and get out of line and go sideways. So it was kind of like this big blob of troops that could be moved in any direction as the battle developed. The other thing now then that the Romans had to learn was road building. And this was the ultimate solution to beating the Samnites. Rome never actually beat the Samnites until pretty much the Empire. Almost 100
BC
was when the last Samnites were wiped out and Samnium was no longer a threat. But the way that the Romans controlled them was by road building. Rome built a road called the Appian Way that went right down the coast from Rome all the way down to Capua, down here in the south of Italy. Now, at first, that was just to transport troops and supplies down to the south of Italy.
But it soon also became valuable for another reason, because
it's much easier to get into the mountain country of Italy from the south here, where the hills are lower, than it is to get into the mountain country directly from Rome, where there's these massive mountains right immediately in your way. So, but once the Romans had built this road down to Italy, they realized what a great idea it was, because they could run troops really fast down the Appian Way. And in no time, Rome had built roads out here to the east coast, to its allies, the Pisines and the Apulians, and pretty much Rome just surrounded Samnium with roads. And so that was the next great skill that Rome learned. So by the end of the Samnite Wars, Rome pretty much controlled all of Italy except this bright green and orange in the south, where the Greeks lived. And that will bring up the next phase of Roman history, the wars with the Greek world. So here's the next phase of Roman history, the wars with the Greek world. And the first war that the Romans got into was called the Pyrrhic Wars. Now, southern Italy was known to the Greeks as Magna Graecia. It was kind of like their summer vacation houses, or their suburbs. Because Greece had been sending colonies into southern Italy and Sicily also down here for hundreds of years. And so Greek thought of this as their own backyard.
And to this day, you can see that the Italians who live there look Greek.
Now, you have to keep in mind what's going on in the rest of the world. While Rome was fighting these Samnite Wars, in fact, in the very year 333, another great hero was conquering all of the East as far as India, and that was Alexander the Great. And when Alexander the Great died, his kingdom splintered into 4 parts. There was the Seleucid Empire here in
yellow in
Turkey and Syria, and into Persia. There was the Ptolemies
in blue down here in Egypt.
Up here in Macedonia, there were the Philips
in green.
And on the western edge of Greece here,
in tiny little Epirus in purple,
there was this guy, Pyrrhus. And hopefully you can remember that, because Epirus sounds a lot like Pyrrhus, doesn't it? So what happened with this situation was that
Pyrrhus
decided that he wanted to conquer just the way Alexander did. He had ambition. And instead of Alexander going east, Pyrrhus wanted to go west. So what's the first thing that you have to conquer west? Well, it's Italy. So
Pyrrhus
got together this high-tech Greek army and went basically as a bulldozer right up the peninsula, heading straight at Rome to teach those Romans a lesson, because he had seen how Rome was encroaching, and it was evident that if Greece was going to expand,
then Rome would have to be controlled or even conquered.
So his juggernaut bulldozer, steamroller, went right up the peninsula, defeating Romans in battle after battle after battle. But as he would go, he would lose an equal number of soldiers as to what the Romans would lose each time. And so this was where we get the term Pyrrhic victory, because one of his generals congratulated him at one point when he was getting close to Rome on the victory, and Pyrrhus's response was, "Ha ha ha, one more such victory and we are done for." So Pyrrhic victory is when you win, but it's so costly that it's not worth it. So Pyrrhus got with it in sight of Rome, but by this time his army had been whittled down so much that he just didn't have the troops to lay siege to Rome. And so, like often happens in history, he had to retreat away and try to get resupplied on the eastern coast of Italy. And the Romans recovered and basically drove him back into his possessions here in southern Italy, where all the Greek city-states would support him. Well, Pyrrhus wasn't one to be outdone. If he had gotten his nose bloodied with Rome, he thought he could still go west if he conquered the Carthaginian possessions down here in Sicily. Well, he went into Sicily and did that and pretty much wiped out the Carthaginians pretty quickly. But he couldn't conquer each Carthaginian city around the edge of Sicily. Why not? Because the Carthaginians had a navy, and Pyrrhus didn't have a navy. And so that meant that the Carthaginian garrisons could just sit there in their cities and get resupplied by their navy, and Pyrrhus couldn't do a thing about it. So he was kind of wondering what to do, and lo and behold, guess who appeared on the scene? But the Romans. Well, Pyrrhus had had enough. He uttered this famous phrase, I think I'll leave Sicily to these two tigers. And Pyrrhus returned to the Greeks in southern Italy, and that was pretty much the end of Pyrrhus. Well, that started the next phase in Rome's war with the Greek world, and
that was the Punic Wars with the Poini, the Phoenicians of Carthage.
Rome coming into Sicily then was the spark that started the First Punic War. So Rome kind of recognized Sicily as a Carthaginian possession by right, but Rome was kind of greedy here, admittedly, and they enabled themselves to be sucked into the cauldron of supporting Syracuse down here in southeastern Sicily. Syracuse asked Rome for support, and the Romans came to their aid, and that was kind of Rome's excuse, as so often happens in history, to engage in a war and start expanding its own possessions in that area. Because whenever you ask Rome to come help you, they'll come help you all right, but they're coming to stay. And that's what happened here. So Rome came into Sicily and slowly started pushing back the purple Carthaginian tide here in Sicily until they'd conquered all of Sicily. But once again, they ran into the same problem that Pyrrhus ran into. And what do you think that was? They didn't have a navy, right? So the whole story of this
First Punic War is that it is
Rome learning to build a navy so that it can challenge Carthage at sea. And that was the next great thing that Rome learned, which was how to build a navy. So, unlike Pyrrhus, Rome was very willing to adapt, and they found a wrecked Carthaginian ship on their coast, and they copied it, and they copied it 200 times until they had a navy. And their men practiced rowing on the land, and then they got in the actual ships once they were ready and practiced rowing, and sailed around the Bay of Naples, and then announced that they were ready for sea battle. Sure you are. Romans cruised on down here to the Aegatis Islands, which is basically where the Liparian Islands are, and fought a sea battle there and got wiped out. A third of their fleet did, at least. And so they didn't know how to fight at sea, but they learned from their lessons and were a little more careful the next time. And they also developed one idea of their own about how to fight, and that this was their next adaptation. They developed the corvus, which was a
gangplank
enabling boarding of another ship. And the Romans would drop it onto another ship, and this spike here in the end would dig in and hold the ship in place so that the Roman soldiers could go rushing across and turn a sea battle into a land battle. And so in the next Roman war, Rome surprised Carthage here at the Battle of Mylae in 260
BC.
The Romans boarded a third of the Carthaginian fleet before Carthage realized what was going on. and won a great victory. Well, they were just learning, because they had a lot more battles to lose before they could beat Carthage. But for the moment, things seemed good. So they immediately decided, okay, we know how to beat Carthage at sea. Let's go invade Africa. So they came around here 256 to the Battle of Acomus, and yes, beat another Carthaginian navy at sea, and preserved their army intact and landed in Africa. Well, just like Pyrrhus had been a steamroller approaching Rome, Rome became a steamroller rolling across the coast of Tunisia here approaching Carthage. But just like Pyrrhus, they ran out of steam before they got to their goal. And the army was basically surrounded by all of Carthage's allies, Libya and Numidia, and conquered and scattered. So Rome organized a huge fleet to rescue the survivors, and they picked up 90,000 survivors from the coasts of Africa and sailed back to Sicily, and boom, got sunk by a storm. The Romans, it said, lost 90,000 people drowned in the storm. Wow, well, that was a huge disaster. Well, Rome has experienced many disasters in history. It doesn't stop them. They raised another fleet. The next fleet came down and boom, was sunk in another storm. Another 100,000 soldiers die and hundreds of ships lost. Rome actually lost 3 fleets to storms. And it looked like Rome itself ran out of money to build these fleets. The treasury went empty. The Romans had to appeal to the citizens to donate money to build another fleet. And they did this, and the theory is that one of the reasons the Roman ships were sinking is that this thing, the Corvus, was making their fleets top-heavy. And so Rome adapted a third time and made the Corvus detachable, so the ship wouldn't be top-heavy. And they also increased the sides of the ship and made the walls higher so that it was more seaworthy. So with this 4th fleet, Rome sailed down to the Liparian Islands and drove off the last Carthaginian fleet, destroying half of it in the process. And finally, Rome controlled the sea around Sicily. And the last Carthaginian army here at Panormus had to surrender and request terms to exit Sicily and leave Sicily to the Romans. And that was the end of the First Carthaginian War. And that will lead us actually into the next Carthaginian War, because the leader of those troops there in Panormus who had to surrender and be humiliated was a guy named Hamilcar. Hamilcar was a great general.
But
Hamilcar was so humiliated
because
he knew he was good, and the only reason he had lost and been forced to sue for peace was because of the fleet that Carthage had lost at sea. Well, Hamilcar's pride was hurt, and Hamilcar took his 2 sons, Hasdrubal and this guy, Hannibal, and the story is that he made them swear on an altar as children. They were just children, and made them swear eternal enmity to Rome. And that was the source of the Second Punic War,
which was Hannibal terrorizing Rome for a decade. But first it started
with Hamilcar expanding in the west into Spain. First off, let's look at the situation at the end of the First Punic War. Rome, as part of its treaty, got the islands, and Carthage got Africa. They did not have Spain yet. Well, the story of the Second Punic War is that each side goes to expanding around the edge of the Mediterranean, and when it gets to the other city, that's when the real war starts. So Hamilcar started expanding into Spain. So Hamilcar and his troops got back to Carthage. Let's go with that first. And the troops had to be paid, but Carthage's navy, by which they would engage in merchant activity, was gone. Now this was a great problem for Carthage, because Carthage didn't have a citizen army like Rome. No, Carthage wasn't a city of soldiers. Carthage was a city of merchants. And the only time Carthage ever gets soldiers is when they hire them and pay them gold. Well, Carthage was all in debt at the end of this war, not only because they had spent all the money to fight the war already, but also because part of the terms were that Carthage had to pay Rome a war fine, or an indemnity, of
2,200 talents, or 2,200 amphorae. That's 66 tons of silver.
So all of Carthage's money, if they had any, was going off to pay Rome, so that Rome wouldn't come storming back and do them even more damage when they were all vulnerable, rather than paying these veterans who were streaming back from Sicily and Sardinia, demanding to be paid. So what do you think was going to happen? Well, the veterans revolted in the city of Utica up here. They said, hey, you know what, Carthage? You promised to pay us and you didn't, so we're going to go conquer you. And the veterans from all over the Mediterranean who had fought for Carthage declared war on Carthage. And in fact, they had allies in Numidia and Libya, and these allies sent them even more troops. So there was these huge armies facing off against the local citizens of Carthage, like Hamilcar and his family. Well, Hamilcar was a brilliant general. And the problem was that these armies of the veterans were not united. They had different generals. And so Hamilcar was able to take them on one at a time and basically stamp them to death with elephants. He would maneuver them into like a valley and then send in the elephants right through the center of the valley and stamp them all to death. So it was basically a war of surrounding and stamping. And Hamilcar just wiped them out, either by elephants or by starvation. He tracked them in their cities and wiped them out. Rome actually helped Carthage in this because Carthage protested, hey, we won't be able to pay you our war fine if you don't let us, or even help us a little bit, fight all these veterans. So that was called the Mercenary War. Well, Carthage had learned its lesson. If it was going to fight, it needed better sources of gold than just merchant activity. So Hamilcar quickly expanded into this area, Spain. And you see the tribe here in southern Spain that settled there, the Turdetani. In ancient times, they were also called the Tartessians, or Tarshish. And in fact, it's thought that the city of Atlantis was here in the swamps just north of Cadiz. Archaeologically, it's thought that that city that sank into the sea was hit by a tidal wave. And the Turdetani were important to the Carthaginians because they were the ancient world's great metal workers. They had huge mines of gold and silver and copper and tin, and they developed the art of metalworking, silver smelting, bronze smelting. All these ancient arts is what the tribes of Spain knew. And so as Hamilcar started subjugating and conquering and making these tribes his possession, suddenly Carthage had tons of money, even more than they had had before with their merchant activities. And bingo, in no time, they were able to start hiring these tribes as troops, paying them the very gold coming from their own mines, and hiring the Gauls as troops as well, up here in France. So the beginning of the Second Punic War begins with the death, pretty much, of Hamilcar here on the Ebro River, where he fell off his horse and drowned, and where he was succeeded in control of the armies of Carthage by his son, this guy, Hannibal. And Rome suddenly realized the danger to itself when it saw all these armies that Carthage suddenly had as a result of taking Spain. And Rome had one ally out here in one of the tribes here in northern Spain. And so when Carthage tried to attack that tribe, Rome took the opportunity to redeclare war upon Carthage. Well, let's just first mention that Carthage had lots of armies in Spain by this point, like 3 or 4 armies. And so Rome rushed an army across to support that tribe, and Hannibal here on the Ebro River just bypassed them. Hannibal here just said, hey, I don't care, I'll go around you. And he kept on going, and the Romans, didn't know where he had gone. He just disappeared somewhere to the north. No one knew where he had gone. Oh well. The Roman army went on and relieved its ally out there. Where do you think Hannibal turned up again? Well, if you go back to Hannibal's route here, you see that it goes right over, what's that say? The Alps. The story is that Hannibal took his elephants right across the Alps, right across the glaciers. In fact, at one point it is said that he even melted a cliffside with vinegar to build a path where previously there had just been a cliff face. And then suddenly, out of the blue, Hannibal appeared here in northern Italy in the Po River Valley with 20,000 wearied troops stumbling into the north of Italy. Well, that was bad, but that turned worse instantly, because who is it that was here in northern Italy? Well, remember, it's all those Celtic tribes who really didn't like Rome, all these Gauls. And what do Gauls like? They like gold. And so if Hannibal had the gold, guess what? The Gauls had the soldiers. And in no time, Hannibal was able to hire a huge army, 60,000 troops. And suddenly, Rome had a problem, a big problem. There was a rampaging army going right on through the countryside of Italy, raising the local Italian tribes that they thought they had beaten in all the Italic Wars. Suddenly, Hannibal was contesting for them and trying to get them on his side. And many of them indeed were going over to support Hannibal. Whoa, this was a huge disaster. The story of this Second Punic War, then, once the bets are down and once everybody can see what's going on with Hannibal in Italy, is that each side has its strength and is good on offense and bad on defense. So the first phase of the Punic War is before the Romans have learned to do offense, and they're just on defense. And there are three great battles here when the Romans are on defense in Italy, and they get wiped out over and over and over. So the first battle here is the Battle of the Trebia, up here near the Italian city of Piacenza, ancient Placenta. And the Romans in red here didn't know just how good a general they were facing. And the Roman commander unwisely waded across a cold Italian stream so that the Romans' hands were freezing and they could barely lift their own weapons. They were so cold. And then proceeded to frontally attack Hannibal. Well, Hannibal ate them up. My goodness. By the way, cavalry is the slash, and infantry is solid, or sometimes it has an X. First off, Roman cavalry was no match for Numidian cavalry from Western Africa, and the Roman cavalry was immediately driven off. Then, Hannibal also laid an ambush. So as soon as the Romans had gone past Mago's detachment down here with its cavalry, Mago up here came in and cut behind the Roman allies, because the way a Roman army is, the Romans are all in the center, and then the allies are in the edges, so that if the allies ever revolt and turn against them, well, at least the Roman army won't get split. So the Romans will be able to react in case an ally turns color and betrays them. Okay, so the cavalry and Mago's ambush here came in and surrounded the two flanks and cut in right behind the whole Roman army so that the whole Roman army was surrounded. The allies were just cut to pieces so that only the Romans here in the center were left. But the Romans in the center didn't panic. They formed a square so that they were fighting outside in all directions, and then they just kept on going. They steamrolled and actually cut right through the center of the blue here, right through the center of Hannibal's lines, causing a lot of casualties in Hannibal's lines, and then just kept on going to the nearest city, which they fortified, and sent message back to Rome saying, hey, we just got whipped, and we need you to come save us, because we're caught surrounded here in this city. Well, Hannibal had just wiped out a big chunk of Roman army, because anytime an army or part of it runs away, the cavalry comes after it and just kills a man, and then another man, and another man, until
all the stragglers are slaughtered.
And you'll see a slaughter of like 10 miles as the cavalry wipes out person after person fleeing away from them. So that was the first battle. Well, Rome suddenly realized that this was a serious commander, and they would have to be more careful dealing with him. So their next consul was a guy named Flaminius, and he came up here and faced off against Hannibal and fortified himself in a strong defensive position. Well, Hannibal was smart, and Hannibal started terrorizing the countryside and laying it waste, and lured the Romans out of their defensive position, and got them following him. And here again, Hannibal set another trap around Lake Trasimene, the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal put fake campfires on the far edge of the lake to make the Romans think that the Carthaginians were far away. And then Hannibal laid an ambush in the hills to the north of the lake. So the Roman general Flaminius came marching along here and was foolish. He took the short, easy shortcut straight across the edge of the lake in this narrow pass, and he also did not even send out scouts first. And the Roman vanguard ran right into a hidden wall of Carthaginian infantry troops, blocking them. And then the Carthaginian cavalry came down and slammed the door behind them, so that suddenly the Romans are wondering what's going on. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, the whole mountainside erupted with African and Gallic troops charging down out of the hills into the Roman column of soldiers, which were not even formed up for battle. And the Romans were taken completely by surprise and cut into 3 groups, isolated, and 2 of the groups were wiped out and the survivors driven into the lake where they drowned. And only the 3rd group, as had happened at Trebia, burst through and made it out to a nearby city where they were promptly captured by the remainder of Hannibal's army. So once again, Hannibal had wiped out a consular army, tens of thousands of Roman troops killed, and Hannibal had basically no casualties. Well, it was a disaster. So in this problem, Rome quit the consular system and did as they always do, turned to a dictator. And one guy in charge
of everything to
make a cohesive strategy against Hannibal. And they turned to this guy who was actually really smart and chose the defensive strategy, which Rome should have stuck with for the rest of the war. This guy was named Fabius the Cunctator, Fabius the Delayer. Fabius would not meet Hannibal in battle. He would just harass him. So when Hannibal would come to offer battle, Fabius would melt away into the woods. But when Hannibal would turn to foraging for food, there was Fabius again to harass them and prevent them from getting the food they want, and also to harass the local Italian towns so that they knew that they had not just the Carthaginians to fear, but they also had the Romans to fear. So the poor Italian towns suffered horribly in these years. And so Fabius the Cunctator went for years just facing off against Hannibal. Well, the Romans should have stuck with this policy, but their pride got the better of them. And one time when a lower Roman general had a little success against Hannibal on the offense, they said, "Oh, you must be our solution." And they went back to basically the consular system, even though they called them both the dictators. And one of the weird phases in Roman history where they had 2 dictators, which makes no sense. They were really both consuls for all practical purposes. And flushed with new confidence, they put Fabius aside and launched these 2 consuls and came down here to attack Hannibal at this granary here, a little-known place named Cannhae, which Hannibal had seized. And the 2 consuls came down here and decided, hey, you know what? we have enough troops, we're just going to do a frontal assault until we bust right through Hannibal. And it worked in the last 2 battles. We're just going to do this with a lot of troops. So Hannibal was smart and the Romans were not, because numbers doesn't matter if there is some other respect in which you can gain power over your enemy. So what Hannibal did is, one theory is he surrounded the Romans and cut them off from water. Another theory is that he just boxed the Romans in so hard that only the outer edge of Romans could fight at any given moment. And facing off against his troops, they were no match for the African infantry coming in at the sides. In any case, the Romans formed this nice big block, and Hannibal prominently displayed himself right in the center of his line, and the Romans headed right at him. And the Carthaginian line, which had been a line, just sagged, and it became this semicircle. And the Romans just pushed right into the center of the semicircle. And while they were doing that, the 2 edges that the Romans hadn't seen bypassed them and hit them from the sides. Meanwhile, the Numidian and Spanish cavalry, which is the best in the world for the Carthaginians, came back from driving away the Roman cavalry, as it always does, because the Roman cavalry is nothing, and filled in the rear, and the Romans were completely surrounded. 60,000 to 90,000 Romans were wiped out. It was one of the greatest massacres in history, and the greatest up to that point. At that moment, if Hannibal had attacked Rome, some say he could have conquered it. But as often happens after a battle like this, each side is just so tired that they do nothing but sit down and rest. And that's what the Carthaginians did. Even though they'd won, they just rested. Well, 10 or so legions had been massacred. There was a huge emergency in Rome. Romans went back to Fabius the Cunctator. They also started hiring legions of slaves. Anyone who can wield weapons was put into the army. Old men were put into the army and told, hey, you can guard the walls of Rome. Basically, Rome went back to its old strategy of just delaying. Fabius the Delayer is what this guy means. Well, at this point, Rome had learned that it couldn't beat Hannibal. So, using Fabius's strategy for the rest of the war, they just kept Hannibal occupied down here in Campania, squabbling over Capua, which was a Greek city that supported Hannibal. And Hannibal didn't want to leave Capua because it had a lot of citizens. And so basically the Romans just caught Hannibal going back and forth between Capua and Naples here, squabbling over the little cities here in the south. But they would never give him an open battle. The Romans would just sit behind their lines and then harass the people wherever Hannibal wasn't. So try to get the cities on their side rather than Hannibal's side. Meanwhile, Hannibal was begging Carthage for troops. After
Cannhae
he poured all the rings of all the noble Romans that he had
killed
out on the floor
of the Carthaginian
the Senate and said, send me reinforcements. If you give me reinforcements, I will conquer Rome. And this was kind of the linchpin of the whole war, because Carthage did send Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, over the mountains of the Alps into Italy. And Hasdrubal was coming down here, the east coast of Italy,
to link up with
Hannibal down here near Cannhae. And there was one battle in which the Romans faced off against Hasdrubal with pretty much equal numbers. And the historians say that if the Carthaginians had won that battle, then the next year they would have had 4 armies in
Italy.
Hannibal's army, Hasdrubal's army, a Spanish army under Hanno that was getting ready to come into Italy, and then a 4th Carthaginian army. Unfortunately for the Carthaginians, the Romans wiped out Hasdrubal, beheaded him, and threw Hasdrubal's head into Hannibal's camp. Whoa, what a disaster. Suddenly, Hannibal doesn't get reinforcements. Suddenly, that army that was going to come into Italy under Hanno had to sit back in
Hispania, Spain,
and defend against the Roman victors of that battle themselves now coming into Spain. So the Carthaginians are a step behind the 8 ball here. And that other Carthaginian army, which should have been sent to Hannibal, was then foolishly sent to help out Hanno here in Spain, which was a losing battle anyways, as history will tell us, because the Romans then, for the rest of the war, under the next famous man in history that you need to know, Scipio the Elder, or he would later be called Scipio Africanus in recognition of him conquering Africa, then just started rolling back the Carthaginian tide in Spain. He beat Hanno in battle after battle and conquered the towns in Spain over the course of years and years until he crossed into Africa and quickly swept across Africa, picked up the allegiance of the Numidian cavalry, because Numidia here is in the west of Africa, and then came right up to the gates of Carthage. And lo and behold, at this point, Carthage had no choice but to cease their successful offensive strategy under Hannibal and recall Hannibal back to Africa to fight Scipio. And Hannibal met Scipio at the Battle of Zama, and 2 bad things happened to Hannibal. The main thing was that the Numidian cavalry now came out on the side of the Romans. Best cavalry in the world. The other thing was that right as the battle was starting, Hannibal's first line of mercenaries started fighting with his second line of mercenaries, and they swept off to the flanks in this mass of infighting brawl, so that Hannibal was left with just his third line. And at that point, Hannibal could do nothing but basically run back to the walls of Carthage and barricade himself behind the strong walls of Carthage. And that was the end of the Second Carthaginian War. Carthage was basically conquered and would never be a power ever again. So Rome had survived a close scare again here in the Second Punic War. And after that, they quickly mopped up the other 2 pieces of Alexander's fragmented empire.
The Macedonian Empire
in northern Greece, and then also the Seleucid Empire in Turkey or Anatolia and Syria. And that was no problem for the Romans. And by this time now, the Romans were the dominant player in the Mediterranean. And so that will end this first half of the Roman Republic. In the next half, we'll deal with the Roman Republic now that it was basically the main player in the Mediterranean. And we will see what happens as various factions now start to compete internally inside of Rome rather than fighting externally against Rome's no longer existing enemies. All right, hope you enjoyed it, and see you in the next video.